In the middle of the Hobo Woods, in early 1966, American and Australian soldiers watched enemy fighters materialize from nowhere, open fire, then disappear. They weren't ducking behind trees or retreating into the jungle. They just vanished. For days, 8,000 Allied troops found strange clues. Shell casings embedded in dirt, fresh footprints that ended mid-step, blood trails that disappeared at tree roots. A special American unit was sent in to investigate. Of the 700 volunteers who went looking for these Vietnamese ghosts, 1 in 3 never came back. As 1965 neared its end, though American presence in Vietnam had exploded from 20,000 advisors to nearly 250,000 combat troops, the enemy remained nearly impossible to hunt. It was a daily occurrence. American patrols would make contact in the jungle, unleash artillery and airstrikes, then move in, expecting to find bodies, weapons, and equipment, only to find empty ground. For weeks, General William Westmoreland, commander of all U.S. forces in Vietnam, studied the reports piling up on his desk, each describing the same impossible phenomenon, as if his men were fighting ghosts. Throughout the jungle, the Americans found small tunnels and foxholes, so small they usually collapsed with grenades or explosions. But the way whole Viet Cong units seemed to vanish suggested something far larger was at work beneath the jungle floor than these crude little hideouts. The worst of it was in the Iron Triangle, a 40-square-mile wedge of dense jungle 20 miles from Saigon, a sanctuary from which the Viet Cong could strike the capital at will. Facing this dilemma, Westmoreland knew the stronghold had to be attacked head-on, and he pressed Washington for permission to launch massive search-and-destroy operations. But for an endeavor this size, he'd need more than just American troops. That past June, Australia sent 1,400 soldiers from the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, along with New Zealand units, all placed under U.S. Brigadier General Ellis Williamson of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. Training alongside the Americans, these soldiers mastered the new airmobile techniques, using helicopters to strike fast wherever the enemy appeared. By January 1966, the Aussies, led by Lieutenant Colonel Alex Preece, had earned their place in the 173rd. American commanders, who'd initially viewed them as outsiders, now specifically requested Australian units for tough missions, just like Westmoreland's latest, Operation Crimp. Set to launch January 8th, Crimp would be the largest search-and-destroy mission yet attempted in Vietnam. No less than 8,000 soldiers would sweep through the Hobo Woods, a dense jungle zone just west of the Iron Triangle, where intelligence suspected the Viet Cong had the regional headquarters. Overall command fell to Major General Jonathan Seaman, whose plan was to helicopter the 173rd Airborne into the jungle from the north and west, while the 3rd Brigade sealed off the south. Together, they would drive the enemy eastward toward the Saigon River, where artillery and gunships awaited. Preece's Australians were given the northern flank, the most dangerous position of all. If the Viet Cong broke through there, the entire operation could collapse. The men were set to go in with their own artillery battery, M113 armored personnel carriers pushing through the trees, and the engineers of No. 3 Field Troop, led by Captain Sandy McGregor. Armed with demolition charges, flamethrowers, and tear gas, the engineers were prepared to smash bunkers, clear booby-trap defenses, and expose whatever secrets the enemy had hidden in the jungle. Operation Crimp launched on the morning of January 8, 1966, with concentrated artillery fire, followed by napalm strikes that turned vegetation to ash, and B-52 Arclight missions that sent shockwaves through the earth, blasting everything in sight for landing zones. At first light, the helicopters lifted off in waves, carrying the 8,000 men toward the Hobo Woods. Just past 9:30 a.m., the first wave descended through the morning mist. As boots hit muddy ground, units spread out to seal the area from 3 directions, while convoy trucks ground through mud roads with reinforcements to complete the encirclement. Everything was going according to plan. As Preece's Australians landed on the northern perimeter, they quickly found out the Viet Cong had spent weeks preparing a welcome for them. Every path forward was peppered with traps, from punji stakes hidden in grass-covered pits, tripwires stretched between trees connected to buried artillery shells, and grenades dangling from branches with fishing line tied to their pins. As the Aussies picked their way through this nightmare, an American helicopter swooped overhead and opened fire, mistaking them for enemy forces, until frantic radio calls stopped the friendly fire right before the mistake turned fatal. Before they could even catch their breath, enemy fire erupted from the tree line, taking 6 soldiers' lives, including a platoon commander. Through it all, as Priest's other companies maneuvered to flank the enemy position, the VC fighters kept appearing from behind trees and shallow ditches, firing, then vanishing into the ground. Just then, a company leader radioed in with breaking news. They found an entrance to a fully equipped underground hospital carved from the earth itself. Inside was surgical equipment, blood transfusion tubes, medicine stockpiles, and hundreds of documents. Finally, the United States and its allies had confirmation that these weren't just bunkers or foxholes. The Viet Cong had built something massive down there, and someone would have to go down and find out exactly what it was. By the time the sun rose on January 9th, Captain Sandy McGregor, the lead engineer of No. 3 Field Troop, had spent the better part of the last 24 hours busy clearing booby traps and demolishing bunkers. Now he stood with Priest outside a recently discovered tunnel entrance, arguing with the Americans, who wanted to toss in smoke grenades, some tear gas, seal the holes with explosives, and keep advancing. But McGregor had a different idea. Gathering his engineers around the access point, its opening barely wide enough for a man's shoulders, McGregor prepared to go down, with no way to know if an enemy soldier was waiting in the black, with rifles aimed at whoever came through. The engineer checked his flashlight on one hand and pulled out his service pistol, a 9mm Browning that suddenly felt inadequate for whatever might be waiting underground on the other. After one of his sergeants tied a rope around McGregor's leg to pull him back up if something went wrong, McGregor finally went in head first. The rope cut into his ankle as his weight pulled him down into the earth, and the tunnel's walls pressed against his shoulders. He could feel the air growing thick and stale, heavy with the smell of soil, sweat, and cooking fires, all signs of human habitation. With his flashlight beam only capable of penetrating 2 feet ahead before the darkness swallowed it, through it all, the captain kept his finger on the trigger, ready to respond. Then his boots touched ground. McGregor turned his head slowly, expecting a makeshift hideout, but was shocked by the reality. The walls around him weren't rough dirt, but packed smooth and cut cleanly through the clay. They were even reinforced with bamboo frames. They had only scratched the surface. Over the next 4 days, McGregor and his engineers systematically explored the interconnected passages that defied everything the Allies thought they knew about VC capabilities. The men mapped an underground world using telephone wire to measure distances and compasses to plot directions. The tunnels formed an intricate man-made maze, with side shafts branching from the main passages, and in some areas dropping into 2 or even 3 levels. To one of the explorers, the complex system reminded him of the New York City subway system. Inside, they uncovered weapons stored in dugout chambers, radios running on hidden batteries, and even a printing press stacked with propaganda leaflets. There were medical stores arranged like a field clinic, and crates of documents numbering in the hundreds of thousands, from orders and maps to personnel files and intelligence reports. The deeper they went, the more the tunnels resembled a buried city. Kitchens were vented through disguised chimneys that bled smoke into the jungle floor. Narrow chambers held row after row of bamboo beds. Broader galleries opened into large meeting halls where entire companies could gather and plot or celebrate, all while a mere 30 feet above, the American patrols remained clueless about their whereabouts. Reports estimated they could shelter up to 5,000 fighters, some living underground for months at a time. On the 3rd day, Corporal Robert Bob Botel ventured out on his own and squeezed himself into a narrow passage that seemed to lead deeper into the complex. The tunnel narrowed as he went, walls pressing tighter and tighter, until he realized with growing panic that he couldn't turn around anymore. Wedged tight, he shouted for help as loud as he could, knowing the air grew thin by the second. By the time his men clawed their way down to him, Botel was no more. Despite losing one of their own, McGregor's engineers pressed on, revealing a truth about a parallel world that would reshape the entire war. Australian troops captured 59 crew-served weapons. 20,000 rounds of ammunition, 100 grenades, a single recoilless rifle, stores of explosives, clothing, and medical supplies. At a press conference in Saigon, days after Operation Crimp ended, the captain, the first anti-communist soldier to explore the so-called Cu Chi tunnels, and now a Bronze Star and Military Cross recipient, told reporters his men had hunted through the underground maze like, quote, tunnel ferrets. An American journalist, unfamiliar with the term, wrote it down as tunnel rats instead. The name stuck. When McGregor emerged from the tunnels in 1966, he'd uncovered a weapon more powerful than any the Viet Cong possessed above ground. The tunnel's origins reach back to the 1940s, when Vietnamese guerrillas were fighting the French colonial forces that had controlled Indochina for nearly a century. Outgunned and severely outnumbered, Vietnamese fighters began carving hiding spots into the jungle floor with little more than shovels and picks. These young volunteers, often peasants and teenagers forced into service, worked in shifts around the clock, hauling out the dirt basket by basket. The soil, rich in clay, iron, and other minerals, dried into a cement-like consistency that could withstand even the heaviest of bombardments. As the war went on, the guerrillas learned to dig new sections during the monsoon season when the ground was soft, only to let them bake hard in the dry months. Soon, what started as scattered foxholes evolved into something extraordinary. By the early 1960s, as American advisors poured into South Vietnam, the Viet Cong transformed these old-timey French war hideouts into a true underground network, stretching well over 150 miles. The honeycomb system connected villages, military bases, and supply routes from Saigon's outskirts all the way to the Cambodian border. Entrances hid beneath cooking pots in village huts, behind altar stones in temples, and even underwater along riverbanks. The passages themselves zigzagged at sharp angles, sometimes 120-degree turns, making it impossible to fire a straight shot or send blast waves very far. But McGregor's discovery changed everything, and within days of the end of Operation Crimp, American commanders issued new orders to all Allied forces. Tunnels could no longer be simply destroyed. They had to be explored, mapped, and understood, and then destroyed. For this perilous mission, commanders now relied on the combat engineers, or tunnel rats, specialized soldiers willing to follow McGregor's example and take the war underground into the VC zone territory. These specialized structures demanded specific physical requirements. Soldiers couldn't be taller than 5'5", or they simply wouldn't fit through the passages. Because of this, the majority of tunnel rat volunteers came from Hispanic backgrounds, particularly Puerto Rican and Mexican-American soldiers who volunteered despite knowing the dangers. While the Military Assistance Command scrambled to develop training programs, with no clear manual for this unprecedented challenge, the units had to figure it out themselves through trial and potentially fatal error. The Australians had a slight advantage: the School of Military Engineering outside Sydney, which ran a 3-month course covering mine detection, booby trap disarming, and demolition work. Usually, fresh arrivals were paired with veterans in a 2-man team, where the experienced soldier, designated number 1, would lead the way underground while training his number 2 partner. After 6 months, if both survived, the newer man became a number 1 himself, responsible for keeping the next terrified volunteer alive long enough to learn the tunnel rat ways. But nothing could prepare them for the reality of what waited below. According to former tunnel rat Jim Merritt, quote, "Somehow, I'd convinced myself that my job as a combat engineer was going to be more engineer than combat, that the truly dangerous stuff would be handled by real experts. I was wrong." While it took the Americans until 1966 to discover the tunnel network, the Viet Cong had always known the day would come and transformed their tunnels from hiding places into trap-filled mazes designed specifically for unwelcome visitors. According to former tunnel rat Carl Corey, quote, "The most dangerous part would be psyching up to get into the tunnel. That was the part that was most frightening, because you didn't know what you were getting into." Finding tunnel entrances meant hours of aimless stomping on suspicious patches of ground, testing for hollow spaces beneath camouflage covers. When an entrance was finally located, the tunnel rat would lie flat while teammates gripped his ankles, lowering him headfirst into the earth. This awkward position let him hold his gun, either an M1911 pistol or M1917 revolver, with just 6 or 7 rounds in one hand and a flashlight in the other, the blood rapidly rushing to his head as soil crumbled into his face. Once inside, the team leader probed ahead with a bayonet, checking for mines and booby traps, while his second-in-command watched for tripwires along the ceiling, both men moving by feel as much as sight. American troops who dared to venture down called the strange silence from beneath the earth the Black Echo, where every sound bounced off walls until you couldn't tell if an enemy was 10 feet away or 100, adding to the paranoia. It was a terrifying journey, the air thick with carbon dioxide, ants, scorpions, snakes, and centipedes as long as a man's hand infesting the shafts. Warm water seeped through walls during the monsoon season, turning floors to mud that cut their advances in half. Malaria and intestinal parasites were constant, as were the traps and deceit. Oftentimes, the enemy would flood sections to trap intruders, and other times release poison gas. Casualties from booby traps mounted daily, forcing commanders to weigh every attempt to push deeper. If confronted by a Viet Cong soldier face to face, the tunnel rats had no choice but to resort to hand-to-hand combat. Though some carried explosives, firing these types of weapons in such confined spaces often left them temporarily deaf from the concussion, with their ears ringing for days. Or in worse cases, the noise would disrupt the stability of the space around them. After completing one of the dangerous searches, the tunnel rats would either rig the tunnels with powerful C4 explosives or bring in the flamethrowers, pouring fire through the shafts and igniting everything inside. Given the dangerous and mentally taxing nature of their mission, the brave few short and lanky men who could handle the pressure of being a tunnel rat earned tremendous respect from fellow soldiers, who intently listened to their underground experience back at base, even going as far as adopting an unofficial Latin motto, non gratum annus storentum, not worth a rat's ass. But as tunnel rat Jim Merritt later explained, the dangers underground weren't the only ones they faced. According to the former tunnel rat, quote, "As dangerous as that work was, most of our casualties were above ground, when we engaged in the other part of our job, finding and disarming mines and booby traps." In the years following McGregor's discovery, the war underground only intensified. During 1967's Operation Cedar Falls, more than 30,000 troops of all kinds were sent to destroy the tunnel system, evacuating entire villages in the vicinity to then drop more ordnance than fell on Japan in World War II. But by the time the American forces returned months later, not only did they find the tunnels rebuilt, but the craters made by the attacking B-52s now served as new entrances. The following year, the Tet Offensive proved a major failure, and the Viet Cong used the tunnels to position thousands of their fighters around Saigon, emerging simultaneously and ready to attack. As the decade neared its end, the job that had shocked the world in 1966 had evolved into even more countermeasures. The Viet Cong placed venomous snakes, spiders, and scorpions in the tunnels, along with sharpened sticks coated with human waste to cause infection. Poison gas became another weapon, though many tunnel rats refused to wear gas masks since they made it nearly impossible to see, hear, or breathe in the already challenging environment. In June 1969, sapper Jim Merritt stepped off the transport at Nui Dat, 70 miles southeast of Saigon, as Australia's latest tunnel rat. Immediately upon arrival, he was paired with Corporal Jeff Handley, a veteran who'd already spent 6 months underground and lived to tell the tale. Only 4 days into Merritt's tour, his unit headed into the bush for a month-long search-and-destroy mission. By word of mouth, the sappers knew the VC had turned their tunnels into traps, surrounding entrances with M16 jumping jack mines that leapt waist-high before detonating, shredding anyone within 30 feet. On June 15th, they rode out on Centurion tanks with a fresh platoon of infantry. On their bumpy journey, the nervous men barely spoke, each of them having just heard the same rumor. One of their sister platoons had already been torn apart on the first day, before the operation had even begun. On June 24th, Merritt got his first real taste of what tunnel rats faced above ground, before they even reached an entrance, when a personnel carrier hit an anti-vehicle mine. A mere 300 feet from their position, flipping completely over from the blast. Reacting immediately, Handley grabbed his bayonet while Merritt swept with the mine detector, both knowing the VC's pattern. They always seeded rescue routes with secondary mines to catch medics and engineers rushing to help. Careful step by careful step, prodding and sweeping, the duo cleared a path to the destroyed vehicle. On July 4th, another tunnel rat team had been working when they stepped on a cluster of mines. Despite being injured on his shoulder and legs, Sapper Robert Yogi Earl continued marking safe lanes for evacuation and directing other tunnel rats through the minefield, saving multiple lives. Upon hearing the news, the duo jumped at their first chance of getting into a helicopter to travel to the scene, the crew chief waving them aboard a Huey as more tunnel rats, medics, and infantry piled in one by one. But as the pilot attempted to lift off, the helicopter lurched upward, then dropped straight back onto its skids with a jarring thud. The bird couldn't clear the ground. Somebody had to get off this overloaded helicopter. Without thinking twice, Handley turned to his apprentice and told Merritt to get off. It was a kindness disguised as dismissal. In the endless darkness, surrounded by mines, with wounded screaming and more tunnel entrances to clear, an inexperienced number 2 would likely become another casualty. With this, Handley and the team disappeared into the night. By the time his partner and the others returned the next morning, though he didn't discuss what they'd found or cleared, his face told him everything Merritt needed to know. Then, back at Neudat Base after the operation, Merritt witnessed how tunnel rats coped with what they'd seen underground. The veterans, those who survived 6 months or more, had developed their own brutal humor and rituals. At the mess hall, the men would tear each other's uniforms to shreds on purpose, or hurl food at each other, with the new arrivals watching them, utterly confused. The statistics explained everything. Between 1965 and 1972, only 700 men served as tunnel rats out of 500,000 Americans in Vietnam. Never more than 120 in the country at once. 1 in 3 became a casualty, among the highest rates of any specialty in the war. In the war's final years, the U.S. escalated its attempts to destroy the tunnels once and for all. In addition to B-52s dropping delayed fuse bombs, the Allies also used armored bulldozers to scrape villages to the ground, and chemical defoliants stripped away cover. However, every time American forces cleared one area, the Viet Cong dug elsewhere, adapting entrances to bomb craters and linking old branches into new systems. Years after the war ended, many tunnel rats developed health problems from Agent Orange exposure in the contaminated tunnels. By war's end, American and Allied forces had discovered over 4,800 tunnel entrances. The Army's dependence on these specialized soldiers was absolute. Without them, American casualties would have been far higher, and strategic successes far fewer. Some original tunnels survive in the Vietnamese jungle, preserved by the government as historical sites. Tourists can now crawl through the same passages once navigated by Viet Cong fighters and tunnel rats, though without the mines, booby traps, or venomous creatures that made them so terrifying during the war.